And we are live.
Yay!
Awesome. Okay, so we figured out that we were going to introduce each other, but we didn't decide who was going to go first. So
Oh gosh, the pressure.
I know, right? So I'll go first. Today I am here with my friend Greg Jacoby, co-founder of Project Mindfulness, and we are going to chat about some fun and interesting things.
Thank you, Erin. This is my dear friend Erin of Heavenly Messenger, and yeah, we've just been like pre-stream chatting for 20 minutes, and
Yeah.
we came up with kind of a nice high-level topic. We're going to talk about generations and the space between generations and generational healing and generational what gets passed on, from good to bad, and just kind of flow through this conversation. And definitely would love to hear everyone's thoughts about what we're speaking about as well.
Absolutely. And on that note, I just realized that we are both live streaming to our personal Facebook pages. So one of the limitations with the platform that we're using is that we don't see the comments that come up on our personal Facebook pages. So I know that I'm streaming on my YouTube channel, Heavenly Messenger, and also on my Facebook page, Heavenly Messenger. And where else are we streaming for you, Greg?
We're also streaming to my personal page,
Yeah.
as well as the Project Mindfulness Facebook page and my personal Twitch. Please meditate.
Awesome. So if you put a comment in and we're not reacting to it, it's likely that we aren't seeing it, particularly if you're on one of our personal Facebook pages. So hop
Yes.
over to one of the others and we'll see your comments.
Or you're just on my personal shit list, and I've made a vow to ignore all of your comments on my stream.
See, the darkness came out pretty early.
It's part of my generational trauma, Aaron. Okay, I'm trying to unlearn this.
So I feel like we should thank every person who you are currently ignoring on your personal page for their help and support in unraveling this generational trauma.
Thank you.
Awesome. And I also realize that we may have people joining us from my Heavenly Messenger page, and often on my page I will do live reading. So I just want to put it out there that I won't be doing any readings today, but we would still absolutely love to hear from you, that any comments that you have. I'm just really grateful that you're here.
Yes, absolutely. And questions, of course, are welcome too.
Yes.
I wish it would be so cool if people could just like join in on the stream to ask questions. I know it's possible on some platforms, but like with multi-streaming, obviously not. I just feel like it's such a pertinent topic for people, because who has not experienced both the blessings and curses that our family has passed on to us? Most obviously our parents or our caretakers, that are, the adults that were in our immediate vicinity when we were children. And then, I feel like for me, it was fascinating as I grew up to kind of hear more stories about family members that I wasn't so personally connected to, or family members that had passed before I met them. And start to thread together little components of my parents' behavior and also my own behavior that I was like, wow, this seems to have been happening for at least 2 generations. And there's no easy way for me to confirm that, but that was such a revelation for me to realize like that these cycles are not necessarily short cycles.
Exactly. And, it's really interesting. I think one of the things that you said there is that often there are people that we hear about that we haven't had experiences with in person, or the experiences that we had with them were while we were still quite young. And so we don't have the perspective of an adult. And that in the sharing of the experiences of those past generations can also really show and highlight where things might be carried on, that perhaps that person was more than that particular experience, but that was the part that was remembered, and that's the part that has been shared. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Yes, absolutely. And how coincidental you could say that that's the piece that gets passed on, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Super
absolutely.
interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
whether it's
Hi,
positive
Bethany.
or
Hi,
negative.
Corin.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, yeah, I don't know. For me, for instance, in my family, there's this. We had my grandmother passed away. Oh shit, when did she pass away? Maybe 2 years ago, 1 year ago. I'm
Oh,
not
okay.
great with timelines.
But
Um,
relatively recently.
Relatively recently, and
Mm.
there was this whole. She was 94, I think,
Wow.
and in the last few years of her life, her um, her cognitive ability started to decline.
Hmm.
And what came along with that loss of cognition was, incontinence and, intense forgetfulness and, strong emotional outbursts at times. And my dad had made the commitment to take care of him while his brothers were, had some distance, living a little bit too far away to have that day-to-day contact.
Hmm.
And it was such a fascinating process for me to watch
Hmm.
the dynamic between my uncles and my dad and their mother
Yeah.
and, see the vestiges of trauma and see that like you know, realize that there's a history behind the way that they treat each other
Hmm.
and realizing that, this dynamic is not just coming from this active situation where mom is dying and dad's caretaking. Like this dynamic was born from 70 years of relationship and,
Hmm.
God knows what occurred when they were all children, right? Of course, I don't know,
Yeah.
and it was so interesting to see that reflected and then to kind of reflect in myself, like, how will any unresolved patterns that I have with my parents reveal
Hmm.
themselves when, if and when, for instance, one of my parents loses their cognitive ability and I start to interact with them from
Yeah.
a completely different vantage point than
Hmm.
ever before.
Absolutely. And, I think you've touched on a really interesting point, and that is around the patterns that we develop in our early relationships. They are some of the most difficult to change and adjust because they're so well worn. Siblings have this incredible ability to like hit the right button just in the right place to trigger you, because they were part of the creation of the trigger. So they know exactly where it is. They know exactly how to press it. And you're right. Then expanding that and looking bigger. Okay, so what kinds of impact is this going to have on how I interact with my family in the future, with any children I may have, or relationships as we come into adulthood? How easy is it, even as a mature adult, to slip back into the dynamics of childhood with your family members?
Mm, yes. Yeah, and I think, yeah, that's so important, Aaron, because I feel like a few things for me. First of all, around triggers,
Hmm.
where sometimes a triggered state is really obvious, if you've had, even just a little bit of education about what that looks like, it can be
Hmm.
really clear when someone is in a triggered state. And
Hmm.
there are, really obvious examples of that, like a panic attack, right?
Right.
That's some
Yeah.
form of a triggered state. Um,
Hmm.
but sometimes these triggered states are honestly impossible to see unless you know that person really well. And I think that, you know, part in some of our families and some of our generational conditioning, we learned to hide those triggered states really, really well, really
Yeah.
expertly. We
Yeah.
became like such skilled actors at hiding when we're triggered. And
Mhm.
I think that as we age and our personalities may become more crystallized, that ability to hide the triggered state can then start to masquerade as I am not in a triggered state. You know, you start to
Absolutely.
become so removed from the fact that you're pretending that you're not triggered that you actually
Mhm.
start to believe that you're not triggered at all. And
Mhm.
so a lot of really intense and often harmful behavior can stem from the fact that you're in this triggered state, but you don't even know that you're in a triggered state because you've spent
Mhm.
so much time hiding it or even directly being told that it's something else.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. I did a presentation last weekend, and one of the things that I was talking about was self-care and proactive self-care. And part of what triggered that conversation for me is the realization that a lot of the depression that I've dealt with, it's got lots of different aspects to it, but that it started presenting when I was 9 years old. And I wonder from that perspective if because it was such a learned behavior to function around it because one, it wasn't recognized and wasn't diagnosed, and as you say, was told to just keep going through it, if that then also creates a very high functioning person who deals with depression, right, and the difficulty in understanding and recognizing that. So it's interesting that you bring that up.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting, like this idea of high functioning individuals who are also struggling with mental health issues. And I think that accounts for a lot more people than any of us realize.
Mm-hmm.
Um, where again, there's kind of this misconception that if you're high functioning, then that must mean then that what you're struggling with must not be so serious.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, it's just it creates so many challenging stigmas and dynamics to work through where it can become hard to take that first step on the path to healing when there's no one around you except yourself who can really take that brave step forward to recognize that there are these unresolved patterns in yourself. And it's I feel like for me, like with trauma that I've taken in from my parents and even non-trauma
Mm-hmm.
patterns that are not that great. I wouldn't necessarily call them trauma, but I just in the process of my growth, like I feel really grateful for the experiences in my life. Like I wouldn't change them, even though a lot of them were really quite negative. I
Mm-hmm.
feel grateful. I feel like I grew so much from them. But even that viewpoint, I did some therapy last year and I was talking with my therapist and um having someone where she was like, "Oh, like that's trauma. Like that's what you're describing is trauma."
Yeah.
And it's like I intellectually knew that, but there's a different understanding like it's a different place to really acknowledge that, wow, you really experienced things as a child that were really unsavory. And it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have to be something so extreme. I think a lot of people will push aside their recognition that something was trauma because they weren't explicitly physically abused, for example, things
Right.
like that. Um,
Yeah.
there's so many forms that can come in, and it's all relative. It's all relative.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think having someone outside of yourself identify an experience as having been a traumatic experience helps to validate what you've experienced and the fact that maybe you've had a difficult time moving past it, or it's in other ways shaped you in a detrimental way, or shaped future experiences in a detrimental way.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah, I'm curious, Erin, like where when it comes to generational healing for you, what kind of tools or experiences have you encountered that helped you through that process?
So there are actually several things that have helped me. I'm in an interesting situation in that I share space with my parents. So I have stuff thrown at me on a very regular basis, which I can see as being, a positive, but also kind of really keeps it at the forefront. And one of the biggest things for me has been to step back and to look at the bigger situation, to remove myself from the experience that I'm having and saying, okay, well, what has caused this? And one of the big things that I've realized in my particular family is our generations are quite large. Between my dad and his father, there were 40 years, and between my dad and me, there are 34 years. So in we have three generations that are 74 years. Like
Wow.
my grandfather was born in 1906, so that's a pretty big space. And one of the things that I've learned is that there has been improvement from each of those generations, because I hear the stories about my grandfather. I'm like, wow, that is a completely different world. And then I look at my dad and I'm like, we're not in the same, but I see how far you've come. And
Mm,
I think that level, I think working to bring that compassion to see like how much growth there has been, how much healing there has been significant. And then I can say, if you have gone that far, then how far can I go in healing this for myself and for any
mm.
future generations?
That's really beautiful. Yeah, that's really beautiful to acknowledge
Hmm.
and difficult, at least in my experience, can be
Thank
very
you.
difficult. It's like, I
So
don't give a fuck how far you came. Like, damn, like this is crazy. Oh my gosh. But no, really though, like wow, that feels really resonant with me, and
mhm.
it is true. It is true. Um, it's really interesting because I feel like even in more extreme examples,
Mhm.
it's always different than the past generation. Like there are these cycles that are passed on, but it is always different.
Yeah.
And yeah, it can be really important to acknowledge those differences.
Yeah. And one of the things that I'm thinking about in particular, the trigger points tend to be around, say, race or around sexuality. And I think one of the things that it brings up for me is how important it is to be open to what's happening around me instead of taking what I learned and what I knew and just blanketly applying that to things that come up in the future. So
Mm.
I think that's part of what I see in that pattern. What about you, Greg? What has been instrumental for you in healing or recognizing generational trauma?
It's really interesting. Yeah, when I asked you the question, I had that a moment's awareness that this would question would then be reflected back to me, and I was not prepared for it at all. So I think the first thing that comes is a memory.
Yeah.
Um, when when I was a teen, I was suicidally depressed, regular intense panic attacks, paranoid delusions in my panic attacks. Was really very mentally unwell. And when I started to, a lot of intense anger, resentment towards my parents, and when I started to come out of that, there was this clear recognition that, I love my parents, despite what happened, and
Hmm.
that I spent a lot of time. Part of what I was taught when I first started practicing meditation was um, to conceptualize your own death. And in the process of conceptualizing that, I realized that if I were to have no relationship with my parents, that would be a deep regret at the time of my own passing. And so, I resolved that whatever the relationship will be, I need to have a connection, a relationship with them, something. And that was a big first step for me, was to, and looking back, it really was a first step. It's so interesting because at the time it felt like this unbelievable revelation, and I'm like letting go of all this pain, but it's not, maybe it is that easy for some people. It wasn't for me. And, now going through this process of years, I just been recently having these conversations with some friends of mine in the last year or so, where I realized that I see the potential to deepen my relationship, but I also see the amount of effort, personal effort that would take. And I have spent really a lot of time like sitting down and thinking whether it has value or not, and whether it's worth it or not, and having that clash against values that I thought I had, which is that, wow, it's so important for me to work through personal barriers and blockages and emotional blockages, and then have this clear opportunity to do some really serious work with my parents while they're alive, where to like directly approach certain topics and try to work through them. Maybe it would be, mutually successful or not, but I see this opportunity to do something that I would have intellectualized was important to me in the past. And there's this whole big thing that's just like, oh no, ain't no way we're doing that, like, it's not happening. But that's been just the process of thinking about it has been quite healing for me, where I can see the different sides to it, and it helps me see and recognize like the compassion you said, where I know that there's the person on the other side may be having a similar experience, where there's a desire to deepen, a desire to reach out, but also resistance and pain, and not really sure how surrounding that desire.
Yeah, absolutely. I think compassion is a really significant word in that as well. And being able to recognize that we are all doing the best that we can with the resources that we have. And the resources that we have are things that can shift from day to day, but we also can recognize that people, for whatever reason, haven't learned or experienced certain resources that might be required in the healing. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I feel like for me, there's always been this, it definitely ties back to my own personal trauma, where it's like, there's this resistance that says something like, I don't want to be the person to guide them through this process. I don't want to do that. I don't want to have that responsibility. But then you're faced with this, not necessarily fact, but potential fact, where it's like, well, fine, no problem. But if you don't, it's not going to happen.
Right.
And then like tying back into my conceptualization of my own death, like that's it, like that's a permanent decision. Even if you want to kind of imagine that, like, oh, you have time, and certainly maybe I do. I hope that I do. I don't, I hope that my parents have long lives and keep their ability to connect. But both of my parents are in their early 70s. And, aside from their age, life isn't certain. So there's no, this moment to moment decision. Every time I make that decision not to take that responsibility, that is potentially a permanent one.
Right.
And that's really, often feels quite intense to me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting because I hear the flip side of that, of not wanting to be the one to bear the brunt of leading them through because of the amount of like learning and everything that needs to happen. I wonder if I can share like a spirit experience.
Oh, yes.
So part of my work is as a psychic, and occasionally I'll connect with deceased loved ones who have crossed over. And often people are asking me about it because there are things that have been unresolved in their relationships, particularly parent-child relationships, but all sorts of relationships, partnerships, siblings, friends. And often people are wanting to connect because there has been like a disconnect. There's a regret that's there. And I find that the level of connection that people can have with their loved ones once they cross over can actually be
Mm.
quite significant. And a
Yes.
lot of a lot of the things that we're talking about that are challenged by physical life experiences here, not having learned compassion themselves or not having had a space to be hurt or whatever it is that's standing in the way of that communication. There's ability to repair and to have that connection once the person's on the other side, because those ego experiences are no longer part of their experience and you're connecting with them at soul level.
Mm.
There's also the opportunity to connect with someone while they're here and to connect with their higher self and to have that healing relationship with higher self, with the hope that whatever healing you come to with higher self, with their higher self, is able to trickle down into their physical ego experience and has the
Mm.
ability to shift the relationship that you currently have. And so
Yes.
that might be something that can help and support an existing, like a relationship with somebody who is still here, without having to go through the heavy work of being the one to lead them through. That there could be other supports that are available to them on a higher, different level.
Mm. Thank you so much, Erin. That's really, really valuable and important perspective.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of a loving kindness practice where, when I teach loving kindness,
Mhm.
there's often it can be really hard, especially with certain individuals.
Yeah.
And there are tricks where you can imagine that person sleeping,
Hmm.
or you can imagine them as a child. And um, yeah, what you said really resonates with that. Like, yeah, after they pass, like, you know, connecting with that deep sense of them, and having that healing process through that connection. And yes, also connecting with their higher self, envisioning the aspects of them that are free from um, the worldly conditioning and pains that they have picked up along their journeys and
Yeah.
have subsequently shared with you. That's so, so powerful and such a
Absolutely.
great reminder.
I love what you have added to it with, seeing them in a peaceful state or seeing them in being in that vulnerability and that innocence and that purity of childhood. I think that's a really beautiful element to add. Thank you.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I have my younger sister is
Mm-hmm.
severely brain damaged,
Mm-hmm.
and she's been that way since a little bit after birth, and no one really knows what happens. There's no diagnosis. No one knows what happened,
Yeah,
and that has been a serious hinged point of deep pain and difficulty for my parents specifically. Um,
absolutely.
you know, it's interesting because some people, when I share it with them, will say that they're sorry, and but for me, it's like she's been that way since I've known her, there wasn't really the pain of expecting a a a, a child with a functioning brain and then
Yeah.
not getting that.
Yeah.
But it's still so interesting, when we talk about innocence and purity, like there's, sitting with her, there's just like this being that is totally like, at least visibly, from what I can sense, there's
Yeah.
no there's no conditioning. There's no
Mm-hmm.
the part of the brain that would get conditioned, she doesn't seem to have that,
Yeah.
and it's just this it was such a fascinating experience to grow up with her, and I feel very grateful for what I learned from her.
Yeah.
Um, and but but what that kind of brings me to is how different people can have such radically different experiences from the same person,
Mm-hmm.
even if that person is acting the exact same way with every person involved.
Yeah.
And I I feel like I I no longer practice in this way,
Mm-hmm.
um, because I feel like it's an extremely intense way to practice, and that's just not where I am right now. But I remember there was a period in my life where I resolved to take personal responsibility for everything.
Mm-hmm.
Everything was my responsibility, and I didn't I didn't believe that, but that was the
Right.
practice.
Right.
And um, part of that radical responsibility is, even when people treat you terribly, you kind of take that as your responsibility, as an aspect of your limited perception,
Yeah.
um, and your reactive points and your triggers. And um, seeing that so directly with my sister, where it's like, for me, I'm just experiencing like this peaceful girl who's ripping books apart and bopping to
Mm-hmm.
music. Meanwhile, you have like my mom crying,
Yeah.
because of what that says to her as opposed to me.
Right. Absolutely. And I can see how that experience for your mom would have created challenge and difficulty and trauma for you as a child, and challenge in your parents' relationship that then carried forward to the connections that they had with you as well.
Of course, of course. Yeah, and I think it really again ties back into that compassion where it's like
Mhm.
no one could have expected that to happen to my sister.
Yeah.
And of course it's traumatizing. Fucking duh. Like that's so intense, you know? Uh,
Yeah.
uh, 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 Even like apart from the emotional implications, even just the
Hmm.
sheer amount of work and the
Yes.
commitment that it takes to commit your entire life to caretaking for a severely disabled child and an individual. Um,
Absolutely.
how intense is that? And, you know, again, like you said, like what you were saying, you reflecting on your grandfather and,
Hmm.
what you know of your grandfather's dynamic with your dad, and realizing how different that is from your dynamic with your dad,
Hmm.
and you know understanding that, again, this behavior does not come from nowhere.
Hmm.
It does not come from nowhere. It was not born out of spite. It was
Yeah.
not born out of the void. Like there is a very, very clear path that this
Hmm.
this cycle was born on and grew through. And
Hmm.
maybe it was a short path that started recently, or maybe it was one that has crossed 75 years, or maybe it's
Yeah.
one that's crossed hundreds or thousands of
Generations.
years.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I'm going to take just a moment to connect with Bethany. Bethany commented a couple of moments ago that she's really resonating with what we're talking about, and that's awesome. I'm so incredibly glad that you're here, and want to open it up that if you have anything that you'd like to share to add to the conversation, please, Bethany, we would love to hear from you. And I also, we missed Sherilyn and Becky a little bit earlier, so thank you for joining us too. Awesome.
Yes.
Coming back into the comment that you have, there's a form of energy healing that I do. It's emotion code and then also body code. And one of the things that we look at is releasing trapped emotions or traumas or experiences from the body, and particularly those that have been inherited. And we can go back many, 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 many generations in releasing that energy. And we know that stress has an impact on our physical body, and it can actually have an impact on our DNA. So traumatic experiences can actually shift our DNA so that we pass things on. I had an experience many years ago with a man. He was a lot older than I was. I was in my late teens, and I think he was in his 50s. And he showed me this birthmark that he had on his calf, and it was in a very distinctive shape. It was quite long, and it was very, very pink, like red color. And his dad had fought in one of the wars. I don't remember which one, and had lost a chunk of his leg in some sort of explosion or difficulty. And it was in exactly this shape and this color, slightly larger. And the scar was so significant that it altered his DNA, that when this man was born, or when the father had the child, that this child was born with a birthmark in the same shape and in the same place that his father had experienced that injury. So, I think if we look at the trauma that we go through and that we experience and realize that it does have a significant impact on us, we can start to see where generational trauma comes into play and how it's passed down, not only through behavior, so the behaviors of the people around us forming and shaping us, but also what is actually in our DNA.
Yes. Yes. Yes, that's really important, Erin, and really interesting too. I think first a brief comment on the DNA thing. I think that any powerful external influence can have these deep effects on our bodies in really minute ways that we can't understand. That we can't understand in a visceral sense. And you reminded me of a really, really powerful song. What's it called? It's called Uncommon Valor, a Vietnam Story, by Jedi Mind Tricks. And one of the lyrics was they rap from the perspective of two different soldiers in the Vietnam War, and one of the soldiers was relishing in the war and enjoying enjoying it.
Yeah.
And he was exposed to chemicals that were used in the war, and they caused all of his children to be disabled.
Wow.
And there was this you made me think of how you don't know how this stuff is going to get passed on. You don't know, and this character that he was singing from the perspective of didn't know.
Yeah.
He from his limited perspective, he was enjoying himself. And it wasn't until later that the real fruits of that experience were revealed to him.
Absolutely. That's huge. That's powerful. I'd like to share that in the comment section. Are you able to type that in on your end, the name of the song and the group there, Greg?
Yes.
Because I feel like
Just
that's
with the trigger warning on that one, it is intense. I can't listen to it without sobbing. Like it's really,
hold on
really
half a
intense.
second. We knew this was going to happen. My headset just cut out. So if you want to keep talking, I'll get it set back up. Would you mind saying something, please, Greg?
Hello, hello.
Okay, good. Whew. Yes, we're back.
Okay, great. Nice. Let's go.
Yeah, we'll just put that one up to Mercury retrograde, and possibly a need for a bit of breath and breathing around Uncommon Valor, a Vietnam story. So
Yes, exactly. Really does though. I definitely don't listen to it in public. I'll break down. Like I'm.
Okay.
I think what you said too about it not just being about behavior. I feel like for me, one of the most amazing tools in my toolkit is the ability to depersonalize trauma. And when you can, I've always taught like, and the way that I kind of conceptualize my internal world is recognizing that these patterns in myself, whether very harmful or very positive or whatever, they're just habits that have been created in my mind. And a habit is a habit. A habit is is a type of addiction, and it's not personal. And that's been really helpful for me to work through my patterns, is to be like, yeah, this is just a habit, and I've beaten addiction before. So I know that I know what this feels like. It's like I know how addictive it is. I know that push and pull that happens. I know all the justification that can come, the shame. It's just an addiction, and I don't have to view it as personal. And I feel like it's the same thing for generational trauma, where when you can, when you do have the blessing of being able to identify something as generational, you can completely depersonalize what you're experiencing completely. And that distance is so valuable when it comes to, pulling yourself out of these difficult patterns where it's like, geez, wow, this sucks. And I've experienced a lot of shame from this or whatever it is. For me, shame has always been a big thing. And, but like, it's really not me. Like I didn't do that. Like that was just in me from as long as I can remember. And I did not give birth to that whatever the fuck you want to, I don't know.
That experience, that thing, that trigger.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow. I have used that technique, but not necessarily in that way. And I love that recognition, because that to me speaks to self-awareness. Like, this isn't mine. This came from somewhere else. And because it's not mine, I'm not going to own it. I'm going to say like, hey, this was part of an experience. It's part of me because it shaped me to who I am now. But I'm not going to allow it to have an impact on me now and moving forward.
Yes.
And that's huge. That's really big.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Yes.
I love what you said about habit as well, because habit is something that is we do without mindfulness, right? It's something that has become programmed over time, over like continuation of it. And you're absolutely right. It is a form of addiction that, if we bring mindfulness and awareness to it, that we can start to shift and change. And that's beautiful. That's powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like, yeah, it's been really useful for me, especially because I feel like that analogy doesn't undermine how difficult it is, because I think most people can acknowledge how challenging an addiction can be
Yeah.
and pulling yourself out of an addiction. But there has also been a lot of a big movement, at least in Western culture, to shift some of the I don't have a better word than blame. Shift some of the weight of that addiction to the fact that some people are more predisposed to addiction for whatever
Mhm.
reason, right?
Mhm.
And it's the same thing with these habits. Like they're I feel like in Western culture, certainly, at least how I grew up in my society,
Yeah.
was that often with these things, these mm, with a lot of actions that we need to take in our life, we have been taught that the impetus behind that action has to be some form of shame, has to be
Yeah.
some form of um, masochism and self harm. Like, this is, this thing is such a terrible thing about me. I hate myself for it. And that energy is going to be what will push me to change. And I know
Yeah.
for me, like, it has been um, such a strong part of my psyche that, I mean, in some ways it's been beneficial because it really has pushed me to change. But also realizing after years of going through that cycle over and over again that you don't need that 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 the step where you're like, whipping yourself
Yeah.
to make a shift, that's actually not necessary.
Yeah.
We've just
Absolutely.
been taught and have tricked ourselves into thinking that that's necessary. You
Yeah.
can free yourself of the guilt. You can free yourself of the self-hatred. You can free yourself of shame. All of those things can be completely non-existent, and you can still have the recognition that you want to change something or release yourself from a pattern, and you can devote your energy to that.
Absolutely. I completely agree. That's incredible and amazing. Um, a, a really wonderful gift to be able to give yourself to say, hey, I don't need to get down to this level in order to create change. And, one of the things that really pops out for me when you talk about that is on an energetic vibrational level, shame has one of the slowest energies and vibrations. So if you're looking to make change, it's one of the most difficult places to make change from, because
Mm,
you're looking to increase or speed up your energy and vibration, but you're starting at a really low and slow point. It's kind of like everybody else is starting the race here, but you're starting it way back here and you have to like
mm,
catch up. So I think when we say, hey, I don't need to go into that place of shame in order to make change, in order to heal, that we give ourselves a step up, an advantage, and it becomes easier. And I love that there's that shift around the idea that we don't have to be in place of shame to get help.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it really is such a sludgy place to work from.
Hmm.
Do you want to read the comments from Bethany?
Yeah, I was just going to say let's go to our comments. So hey to Lisa, thanks for joining us. So Bethany has shared here generations of addiction and using to cope with trauma, marrying someone who had the same patterns and not seeing it until years later, that pattern, making the change within and using compassion and understanding. I also find my parents, due to their age, 70s and 80s, so kind of similar to you and I, that they deal with things differently. I know that I would certainly agree with that. The whole idea of any sort of like counseling and healing was was very foreign to my family. What about to yours?
Um, my mom is spent many years as a psychiatric nurse and had a private practice. And yeah, I got some interesting aspects of that where I learned a lot about it kind of drove home how important it is to work on healing yourself before or while you are working with others.
Beautiful.
How important that joining is of those two aspects. And I definitely I feel quite strongly about that. I feel there's a part of me that always feels like quite indignant about the idea that someone can go straight from high school to college and then exit college with ostensibly not a lot of life experience, and then immediately start helping people through things that they themselves have had no experience with
Yeah.
other than textbook understanding.
Yeah.
And the process of supporting another individual through their own healing process is one that requires well, so many things, but for instance, a deep, deep, deep empathy. And
Mm-hmm.
you know empathy empathy is something that gets generated from the richness and the color of your own experiences. Even if you have not had the exact same experience as another individual, you can develop the ability to step into that person's shoes. But that
Mm-hmm.
ability does not stem from nowhere. That ability stems from the richness of your own experience and your life experience, and how deeply you have felt things throughout your life. It's
Absolutely.
why very sensitive individuals are often associated with deep empathy, because of their ability to feel so deeply.
Mm-hmm.
um, and Bethany mentioned, keeping the conversation open is so important, which I really appreciate that, because
Mm-hmm.
that's often one of the most challenging things, because it's so tempting to close the doors on the
Yeah.
convo, right?
Well, and especially if the relationships didn't start out with conversation, like going back to what Bethany was saying with recognizing patterns and not seeing them until later, until things had been well established. That also says to me that there probably wasn't a lot of conversation around it to begin with. And
Mm,
so to create that openness in your relationships with your adult children, I think is really huge and amazing, a wonderful gift for all of you to have with each other. So um, I just really like to take a moment to celebrate Bethany and everything that she's done for herself and for her family and her kids and everybody else. It's truly amazing, and I want to celebrate you in that. Yeah.
yes. Yeah, I feel like, thank you so much, Bethany. And
Mhm.
it's an inspiring point, because I I grew up with so much frustration about the world.
Mhm.
And, I think that's something that many people experience when you start to realize, how unfair the world is, and how
Mhm.
much tragedy there is on a daily basis. And then you're kind of confronted with this, you know, impossible task of trying to heal the world, right? You want to change things, and it's like, sorry, you
Mhm.
can't. That's
Yeah.
that's you're not going to change the world like that. But as as you grow even further through that frustration, um, for me, starting to understand that, in a non-esoteric sense,
Mhm.
how you're just affecting the people in your immediate vicinity can have a really tremendous effect on
Mhm.
on the world, even the little things that you do. And um, you know uh, role modeling, open communication in your family unit is an extremely powerful tool of change,
Absolutely.
that can have so many rippling effects in ways that you can't even imagine.
Mhm. Yeah, because that has an impact on your direct relationships, but it also has an impact on the relationships that each of you have with the other individuals in your lives, and
Yes.
in friendships and partnerships and in other family relationships. It's really significant. Yeah.
Yes.
I hesitate to use this word given that we're still in some form of pandemic, but emotions are infectious. And there are some germs that are really great to share, and there are some emotional germs that, maybe we want to give back to the earth. And I think, love, laughter, healing, celebration, those are all the positive infectious emotions that we want to share.
Yes.
And getting back to the point that you were making, that it can feel really overwhelming to try to change the whole world. If we just take our little part of the world and we make it as great as we can, then that's going to infect out the other parts of the world that intersect with ours. And if they do better, then it intersects with theirs, and it just continues to grow. And I love the idea of working with others in that it's not just us on our own, but that we can be with others doing that too.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And that sharing, I feel like it's really interesting to me because I'm just kind of making this connection now
Hmm.
where I feel like there's a stereotype about our parents and our parents' parents that
Hmm.
they're they usually are not so skilled in that sharing aspect,
Hmm.
right? Like a lot of that trauma is something that gets hidden and not
Hmm.
talked about and deeply stigmatized. And um, putting that aside for a moment, one of my frustrations in my, spiritual path has been with teachers who operate under a veil of um, a secrecy, where
Hmm.
they kind of present themselves as this untouchable moral superhuman.
Hmm.
And it just kind of occurred to me how related those things are, where again, it's the same exact thing of trauma and the normal process of being in this human experience getting
Yeah.
swept under the rug. And
Hmm.
also like kind of championing this idea of transcending the human experience as if it's something you would want to transcend. And
Right. And
whereas for
strive
me,
for.
it's
Yeah.
right, exactly. Like when first of all, at least in my experience, it's not. There's no. You're not gonna. That's not happening. Like
Yep.
that's a fantasy,
Hmm.
and not a very healthy fantasy.
Hmm.
And and rather on the opposite, it's actually in the deepening of our human experience
Yeah.
where we can let go of um, the deeply harmful, self-harmful, and generally harmful patterns that we've built up. It's actually in the deepening of our human experience, not in shitting on that experience or transcending it. And I feel like for me, like it's become so important. Communication has become so important. Just being direct and honest about your experience. Like, yes, I'm having a really shitty time right now, but yeah, I can still laugh, and yeah, I can still love. And gosh, I'm really angry, or I'm really sad, or whatever it might be. But yeah, I can smile through that, or maybe
Hmm.
not. Maybe I'm crying and screaming all the way through, but
Yeah.
not trying to model that you don't have those experiences, like being like it's okay to have these experiences, it's not wrong, it's not abnormal, you're not mentally ill if
Yeah.
you have this pain. This is just a process, a normal up and down of the human experience that you will always have as long
Yeah.
as you are in this human body. That's part of it. And learning how to ride through that process with grace is like the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. I think that it is really important to recognize that part of the reason that our soul and our spirit is here is to have these human experiences. You know, we have ego for a reason. We have emotion for a reason, because we're here to learn. And so, you know, to bypass any of these human experiences is to, you know, rob your soul of part of the reason that it was here.
Mm,
Yeah. No, I
yeah.
think that's a really important point to make.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting because I mean, it makes sense, right? Like the desire to reject the human experience.
Yep.
Jeez, man, makes so
Yep.
much sense. I mean, this,
Right.
gosh.
I mean, one of the ways that I can describe it for myself is like when I connect and I'm doing readings, I work with the angels in the angelic realm, and the energy and the vibration, it's so high, it's so loving, and it's so beautiful. Why would you want to come back down and have this physical
Facts,
world experience that's
facts.
incredibly uncomfortable and
Yeah,
painful? The other part of what you said that I really love is that you can be many things all at the same time. And that was something that I learned when I was young. Like, if you're sick, you're sick. You can't go out and play and do other things. You need to be in bed, right? If you're sad, you're sad. You can't be a little bit happy, because otherwise you're not actually sad.
oh God,
And
yeah.
right. So I love the permission and the allowing that comes with that statement, that you can be many different things and none of them negate the other, because we are so much more complex than something that is a single emotion or a single feeling. And I think that that permission also can help people in healing, in moving out of those challenging places, because you can still be in a place of challenge but have happy moments, and eventually those happy moments will be bigger than the challenge, and that's part of how you pull yourself out. You don't go from
Yes,
challenge to happy. There's the spectrum in between.
yes, yes, exactly. And for me, what I've really been working on developing in the last year is working on relaxing deeply into a sense of okayness,
Mhm.
regardless of the experience. I've had a lot of issues with my health this year, um, a lot of intense emotional experiences, and just relaxing into okayness. Um, it just, there's this kind of like s- spiritual don't give a fuck. When I
Mhm.
was a kid, like that was my motto. I was always saying I don't give a fuck, which was always a lie. It was
Yep.
actually the exact opposite,
Yep.
where it was like I actually care a lot
Yeah.
and like so much, but it's
Yep.
really, really painful. So I would just tell everyone and tell myself that I don't care, and that was
Yep.
my way of bypassing the feelings. But
Mhm.
there really is an art to not caring, and it's not a lack of care in the sense of a lack of attention
Mhm.
or a lack of responsibility. It's a not caring in an understanding that things don't have to be any deeper than they are. And
Mhm.
have you ever heard of the two arrow sutta in Buddhism?
No, I haven't.
The two arrow sutta is, and I'm going to paraphrase and subsequently, I'm sure, butcher this. So if someone who's more scholarly than me wants to correct me, I welcome it deeply, deeply.
No, no, Greg, we're just going to hold it against you forever and ever. So it better be
Oh
perfect.
yeah, let's go. I'm going to add that to my list of things to feel ashamed about while I'm falling asleep at night.
And Erin held me to it. Oh
Yeah,
God,
that's
no,
right.
that feels really awful. I'm not even going to joke about that. Please share with us your understanding.
Um, so there's this sutta, and the story is about someone who was shot with an arrow, and then they got shot with the second arrow in the exact same spot. And what the Buddha explains is that there's these two layers of pain. And the first layer of pain is the actual experience itself,
Mhm.
where let's say you trip over a stone and you scrape your knee. And that is a painful experience. It's literally painful. Your knee, it hurts.
Yeah.
But then there is a second layer that we put upon ourselves, which is self-made and does not have to exist. It is the um, meta conceptualization of that pain. And so many things can come along with that meta conceptualization. It depends on our own conditioning. Maybe someone will trip and scrape their knee and then start saying, God, I'm so stupid. How could I do this? Oh my God, look at someone's looking at me and saw me scrape my knee. And it's always ironic because that conceptualization of the pain is actually so much worse than
I
the scrape on your knee. And in that sutta, the Buddha explains like the first arrow is not optional.
mm-hmm.
It's just not. But the second arrow is optional.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the arrows after that, they're all optional. And it ties back in. Yes, it's habitual to like
Yeah.
immediately start pouring salt on our own wounds.
Yeah.
But if we can recognize that moment where we have that first instance of a painful experience and we can
Mm-hmm.
see that pain occur and then immediately watch how our habituated minds immediately start to poke at ourselves.
Yeah.
If you can notice that moment in those moments, it's a real opportunity to like put a pause on that
Mm-hmm.
cycle and say, hey, I'm in pain right now. I'm just
Yeah.
going to feel the pain as it is, and the rest of it is bullshit, and I don't need
Yeah.
to be doing that to myself.
Absolutely. That is such a beautiful story to illustrate such a powerful concept and healing tool, and a tool of compassion and self-forgiveness as well.
Mm.
I love that. That's incredible. Thank you.
Mm.
It reminded me, I had the thought just as you were going into the description, and I'd like to share it. I spoke earlier about starting to experience depression back when I was about 9 years old, and it hit really strongly when I was 14, and it really hit ahead when I was about 19. And I was in a place where there was no joy, there was no laughter. It was just all pain. There wasn't anything positive and light, and I became quite sick. And it doesn't matter what happened from there, but what it meant in subsequent years when I started to experience that pain was I knew exactly how deep the hole was that I was going down. And so when I started to recognize that I was going down into depression and into pain, suddenly instead of being here, I'd taken myself all the way down here because I psyched myself into this, and it's going to just keep getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And it wasn't until I stopped and said, hey, like, I don't have to go down into that place, and recognizing that I know how bad it can get doesn't mean that it's going to get that bad. And so I'm going
Mm.
to focus on, this is where I am now. I'm going to do the things that I know that I need to do to balance myself, to keep myself healthy and well. And then I'm going to allow myself permission to come out of it without having to go down as deeply. And
Mm.
the cool thing is, I think that was very similar to the story that you shared, was that it doesn't have to be as bad as you might think it's going to be.
Yes, that's so beautiful, Erin, and
Yeah.
that's such a powerful recognition to have.
Mhm.
And I feel like it's a really interesting part of sensitivity and these types of emotional mental challenges where it's like once you've opened a door, that door never really fully closes again.
Mhm.
When you open the door to rock bottom depression, like that shit's always cracked open, you can
Mhm.
see what lays beyond that door. And I really do think it does create this really interesting effect where you can go there so much more easily and quickly than maybe someone who's never experienced that could.
Mhm.
And or more quickly, just in general, it can be very fast. But it also does provide you that insight where you can see the steps that it takes to go there,
Mm-hmm.
and subsequently decide to take different steps.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm grateful that you brought up that point, because one of the things that I have come to see those challenges as is I've come to see them as the superpowers. Like all of the challenges that we have had in our lives are what give us insight into others' experiences. It helps to create compassion and empathy, or there's the opportunity to create compassion and empathy. And it truly becomes our superpower in how we live our lives and how we implement things in the future.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's always like, that talk about, how these deep pains are what make, a shaman, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what, you know, gives people the space to enter deep healing with others, is their own personal pains that they've gone through. Um, One really interesting one for me was always the paranoid delusions that I would have in my panic attacks when I was younger,
Mm-hmm.
um, where when I first started having them, it was so, I would sit there and I could hear other people's thoughts. This was the delusion. I
Mm-hmm.
could hear them. It wasn't, I think I can hear them. It
Yeah.
wasn't, I imagine that I'm hearing them. It was, I hear their thoughts. That was the delusion.
Yeah.
And I was completely convinced that I was hearing their thoughts. There's no doubt. And
Mm-hmm.
all of those thoughts were incredibly negative and nasty about me.
Mm-hmm.
All of them. From
Yeah.
everyone in my vicinity, how horrible things they were thinking about me.
Mm-hmm.
And it would trigger a spiral effect,
Yeah.
into heart palpitations and a feeling that I was physically dying. Um, and just, total utter panic. And after, healing myself of that, it's really interesting to watch how like that delusional space is open to me. Like I can see like how my mind could just go like ka-chunk, and
Yeah.
suddenly I'm in that space again.
Yeah.
And at this point I feel that I've built up enough you know background awareness that I'm kind of, even if I were to go in that space, there would be this awareness that like I'm in this space, and it
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't be so convincing as it was when I was younger. But
Mm-hmm.
it's just really interesting to me how the these experiences kind of allow you to see it so easily. And now if I have discussions with people who have similar experiences, I can speak to that, presently, because I can see it in my own mind at any given moment.
Mm-hmm. That is so powerful and beautiful to have that awareness.
Hmm.
I had a message that was popping up for you as you were sharing that. May I share it with you?
Absolutely.
Okay. So as you were talking about and describing the experience of believing that you could hear other people's thoughts and you knew their thoughts and that they were always negative, I saw you actually surrounded by loved ones, and I had very feminine voices in my head that were saying, "I love you, Greg. I love you, Greg,"
No.
over and over. And the feeling that at that time when you were most intently feeling that there were people around who were very intentionally creating loving thoughts to share with you, that you
Hmm.
would pick those up as well. So
Hmm.
just that just
Oh,
popped
it
in
brought
as you were
tears to my
describing it.
eyes. It's really beautiful.
So it was
Thank you,
really
Erin.
beautiful to experience. Yeah. Thanks, Greg. How are you feeling?
I feel very at ease.
Mhm.
It's drizzling outside. It's very aesthetically pleasing.
Yes, I announced on the Oracle chat show that I finished just before we hopped on, and I said that we were going to be talking and that I wasn't entirely sure where you were, but I thought you were in India, and hopped on the call and find out that you're actually in Tokyo instead. So, I have the pleasure of connecting with Greg while he's in Tokyo, while I'm here in Canada on Vancouver Island. And it's likely also raining here too, because that's just what BC is
That's
like,
the MO. Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Another thing that I have been noticing is it looks like you have a beautiful halo over your head with the
Oh yes.
reflection of light, and it just felt so appropriate to have that experience with you. Oh, it's from your light.
Yes. My personal halo. I bring it with me everywhere I go.
I was about to ask you about that because that'd be really handy.
That's right. I attach it to my pants while I'm walking, just to, when I'm in the train, people are like, "What is this guy doing?" Like, fucking goddamn
What's he
foreigners.
highlighting with that light?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, dear.
No, I
Yeah,
actually
and
got this lamp from my friend because the light in this room is like bright white fluorescent, and it's extremely aggravating. So my friend, I'm grateful, gave me this much softer light.
that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Awesome. Yeah, and Bethany saying that rain is cleansing. Yeah, it absolutely is.
Mm,
It's such a
so
beautiful
true.
day. Yeah,
So true.
yeah.
Yeah. Mm. Well, I love you, Erin. I always so appreciate having these connections with you.
Me too. Me too. I was just going to say, should we start bringing our time together to a close, because I know that you have an appointment in the not too distant future. Um,
Yes.
but before we go, I would like to share some celebration with you. One of my themes for 2022 that I'm carrying over to 2023 because I didn't embrace it as deeply as I wanted to, was celebrating the things that I have done or achieved or accomplished that have brought me to this point, celebrating connections with people, and just in general, celebrating the moments that we're in. And I'd like to take a moment to celebrate the time that I've spent with you, Greg, with everybody who has also chosen to join us. Bethany has been really vocal, and we've seen some comments from Ruth, and I know that there are others who have joined us as well. So celebration for the time that all of us have taken today, for all of the things that
Mm,
we've done that have brought us to this point.
yes.
Hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you if you've made it this far in our conversation for joining us. It's a pleasure.
Yes. Impressive. Riding the stream of consciousness.
Right. With the occasional tangent and laugh along the way.
Yes, yes. It's like my favorite thing to say to my clients recently, where I'm like, guys, like I'm not prepared for this meeting, so just bear with me in my stream of consciousness. I feel like people are really understanding. You're like, okay, no problem.
Cool, cool. We'll fly by the seat of our pants.
Yes.
I, Greg and I were talking for a little bit before we went live, and one of the things that I mentioned was that I've recently kind of dipped my toe into online dating. And in the past, one of the things that I found on a lot of profiles was that people like to fly by the seat of their pants. And it made me wonder, do people have pants with like a reinforced bum so that they can
Yeah,
fly
right.
by the seat of them?
Literally,
So,
there's little wings, and they're just
right.
like they're flying, they're flapping.
I always saw it as kind of like a little helicopter, but
I
like,
like that. I like that a lot. I feel like it would be really like discombobulating to fly by my ass.
I just,
I would not prefer.
yeah,
It would be difficult.
yeah.
I don't think I could do that.
I would want to be face first. Like I'd want to have angel wings or something like that so that
Right.
I'm not, like, because maybe you'd start tripping on your head, like
Exactly.
if you're flying by your
It's
butt.
dangerous. It's a hazard.
Yeah. So it was a good thing that I didn't contact anybody who had that in their profile because they're just dangerous people to be around.
Deeply dangerous. Red flag. Red
Right?
flag. Red flag.
Do not go. Do not go.
Yes. Yes. Oh my God, I love that. That's so funny. I haven't. That's great. I'm gonna keep my eye out for that one.
I mean, it could be a generational thing because there are a couple of years between us and the phrases are definitely different. But yeah, that was a big one about 10 years ago. So there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna start messaging people and be like, I'm sorry, I really like you, but I can't. We can't go forward like this. I can't. You
Yeah.
fly by the seat of your pants. I fly by the crown of my head. This is not gonna work.
I love it. That really does have wings, like the crowns with the wings from
Yes,
ancient Rome.
exactly. Yes, yes, exactly. Um,
Well, Greg, my Roman god, it was such a pleasure connecting with you today.
you as well, Erin. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you
Yeah,
to everyone who's joined us.
yeah.
Yeah, I hope we don't let it be too long before we do this again.
We'll have to do it again. Absolutely. And soon. Awesome. Thanks, Greg. I hope you have a fabulous rest of your day. And if you're joining us from North America, I hope that you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
You have a great day, Erin, great evening, and love you. Bye,
Love you.
everyone.
Bye.